Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in our wonderful webinar today, the first in a series of fantastic explorations into redefining, reimagining, and simply trying to articulate what is well-being, what is quality of life. Just going to share screen. Oh, not that one. You don't want that. That's what happens when you have too many buttons open. Try that again. That's the button I want to share. While you're all settling in, just a reminder, we are recording. So if you've just joined us and you prefer not to have your face on video, please feel free to turn your video off. All right, so welcome to the New Economy Network Australia and University of Newcastle's first in a series of really fascinating webinars about reimagining quality of life. We are joined today by two wonderful speakers from the University of Newcastle, Dr Hamed Hosseini and Ms Shelley McGrath, and I'll introduce them in a moment. First, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and tell you all about the series, remind you about NENA if you're not already familiar with our work, and then hand over to Hamed to talk a little bit about the research project that we're working on together and which this webinar series is part of. But first, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to invite you all to take a moment to really just take a big deep breath and think about the real world out there. Possibly you're like me, you're inside your office today. I would like to acknowledge that I live in North Brisbane, the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I always like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also the remarkable governance and the governance system and caring for country regime that the First Peoples had across every pocket of this beautiful continent. I also like to acknowledge that the work I do personally and professionally is committed to being part of a decolonising project. The ongoing impacts and legacy of the colonisation of the continent, now known as Australia, continues to have a huge impact on our Aboriginal and Indigenous friends and relatives. And by us being aware of those impacts and working in solidarity together, we can build the future that we all deserve and want on this lovely continent. So please do take a little moment to take a big deep breath and think about your favourite animal or plant, because I think that puts a smile on your face and it puts us into a place of loveliness rather than marching straight into the intellectualization of some of the things we're going to talk about. Anyone who knows me knows I'm obsessed with blue-banded bees. The females burrow in my front garden. They are like seeing a little fairy appear in the greenery. And I hope you have an equally enchanting friend who lives in your community. Okay, on to the business. So in a moment, I'm going to just tell you a very little bit about NENA and share the website so you can explore who we are in more detail. And then Hamed and I will talk a bit about the MOU partnership that we created a couple of years ago now. And I seriously cannot praise Hamed enough for his fantastic vision in bringing NENA into a partnership with the University of Newcastle. It's really cool. And then Hamed will talk a little bit about the research project itself, reimagining quality of life and well-being. And then I will be giving a talk about, well, are well-being economics a viable alternative to capitalism? And the reason I'll be talking about that is that we have an interesting history of the emergence of the New Economy Network, the framing we've used, and the journey that we've all been exploring together. And I'm really pleased to share some of that. And then Hamed will talk about from well-being to well-living. And Shelley will talk about reimagining social change through connection. So, oh, and just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please do write them in the chat as you go along. To make sure that we're efficient with time, we're going to have each of us talk one after the other and then open up for a nice big discussion. In our experience, if we have questions after each speaker, sometimes the last speaker gets a little bit left out. So we want to make sure we go through our material and then share in our discussions together. So to introduce the New Economy Network Australia, what I'm going to do is actually show you our website because I think it's nice to familiarise you with the broad range of rather amazing people who've come together over the last 4.5 years to build the New Economy Network Australia. In a nutshell, we were formed by an early conference in 2016, where 150 people came together at a conference organised by myself and Bronwyn Morgan. And it was at that conference that we asked the group of participants, do you think Australia or we need a civil society network to actually talk about economics, to challenge the current systems that seem to be failing our environment and people? And there was unanimous support. But in a minute, in my actual talk, I'll tell you about some of the challenges we had in bringing everyone together, because people belonged already to different pockets of economic thinking. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And it explains the almost meaningless term of new economy. That was actually a deliberate strategy back in 2016, but that's part of my talk. So the best way to think about NENA is a lovely network of people all across the continent who are all working in different areas, like different disciplines, different processes, different approaches. And I'm just scrolling down here. So on our website, you can see our sectoral hubs. And sometimes this is a very concrete way for people to understand what the network is doing. NENA is a pure network. It's not trying to create big projects. It's trying to bring people together, open up important conversations, support sharing and learning, particularly peer-to-peer learning and sharing, with a really strong focus on finding a safe, fun place to experiment and to actually create new projects between our members, and to keep doing the work that people have been doing for decades, which is building a whole range of on-the-ground projects that are really quite different in their approach to the current economic system. We have an annual conference in November. We have multiple sectoral hubs and a whole bunch of cool things coming up, including, if you're on this webinar because you're particularly interested in the intellectual or academic side of research, we've got a research jam tomorrow. You might want to come back to our website and click on the button. So there's a lot of really amazing things going on in NENA, and it's amazing because we now have 400 paid members in our cooperative. We're unfunded, it's run entirely by volunteers, and we have more than 6,000 people connecting across our mailing list and social media. So it's a space that we're building so that we can keep building together and to start creating some really amazing opportunities. I might just quickly mention the MOU between the University of Newcastle and NENA, but then I'll hand over to Hamed to speak about the research project before we jump into my presentation and then the others. So a couple of years ago, I was invited to be part of a conference that Hamed and others had organised. And through that connection, and I'll let Hamed talk about his work, I was really excited when Hamed got in touch with NENA, suggesting that we open up a formal opportunity for the civil society, a network which has researchers and academics, but an awful lot of amazing on-the-ground grassroots projects, practitioners. And Hamed suggested we find ways to work together to really explore new areas that might need research or stronger analysis to continue the great work that people are already doing. So Hamed, I will stop talking now and hand over to you, and then I'll jump back in when it's my turn. And don't forget to mute. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, for the very fabulous introduction. Well, Michelle covered the NENA side of the story very beautifully. And if you allow me, I will quickly cover the university side of the story behind the project. Which actually started, as Michelle mentioned, in 2019 when we had a symposium. In 2018, a group of us at the University of Newcastle received a little bit of funding to establish a research network. We all shared a lot of concern about the way that the current trends in social change, in ecological change, are evolving, especially towards a not very pleasant future. And we also, as a team, shared this idea, or the team was of the view that criticism, which very much determines what we in social sciences and humanity normally do, or problem solving, is no longer adequate. And we need to actually become a little bit more transformative by saying that we need to also try to encourage a research that that helps people to move beyond the status quo, to help them to build the societies, the futures they want to live in. So to be transformative, we realize that actually we need to pay more attention to future and study the future. And this is, as you can imagine, it's a very big dilemma, because it's much easier. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's much easier to study the present and past trends than studying futures. So what are the potential futures? And when we look at the possibilities, we realize that we can talk about two types of future. One was studying possible futures. By that, I mean the ones that are more likely to happen. To do that, we actually, and the second type of the futures are the ones that are the plausible futures, that are less likely, but they are more promising and less gloomy. So why there's such bifurcation? Why there's such a duality here? Why the possible futures can't be plausible futures? Unfortunately, that is related to the very specific time in history that we are, because many of our problems are so rooted in the system that makes it more difficult for many of us to achieve the plausible futures versus the possible ones. So that indicates that bifurcation, that duality between the two actually indicates that there is a serious problem with the system. So what method we should go for if this is the case? I think if you're interested, and there are many other groups that are interested in studying possible futures, you normally do some speculative work. You look at how social changes, political changes, economic changes, ecological changes have evolved in the past and the present, and then you can extend your imagination and see how they may evolve into the future. And that's a kind of a speculative work. But when it comes to the issue of plausible future, that doesn't seem to be the case, because the trends don't indicate that the plausible future is awaiting us anytime soon. And as I said before, it's because of the crises we face today are so embedded, are so rooted in the modern human civilization. So when we look at the system, the current system that has dominated the entire world, you may call it capitalism or whatever, the modernism or whatever, we realize that this system is very much, I would say, addicted to 5 substances, which is very difficult for the system to free itself from such a bad addiction. One is capital, that has replaced labor as the ultimate source of value; carbon, which by that I mean, of course, fossil fuels, non-renewable energy sources; compulsive growth, this compulsion about growth, growth maniac mentality; consumerism, coloniality, corporate welfare politics, which we call them the 5 C's. But it's not the whole story. We also have many movements, in opposition, in resistance, that push for change. And they reject this. They try to free the system. They try to free societies from such huge addictions to the 5 C's, and I call them 5 Ds, and I'm sure you can easily guess what I mean by the 5 Ds: decapitalization, decarbonization, degrowth, decolonization, and decorruption, or delegitimization of the corrupt political systems. So but how about studying plausible futures? I think that's a very interesting one, because if you want to study plausible futures, you need to study the forces that are pushing for the realization of such plausible futures, such highly necessary futures. And when we look at, so we had that bit of money in 2018, we set up that symposium. NENA contributed very well, and their contribution was very valued. Michelle was one of our keynote speakers, and the love story started from there. And we thought that NENA is a great partner in that area. NENA is part of these transformative forces that we have in this country. And as Michelle just mentioned, NENA is a network, it's a pure network of organizations and individuals working to create an ecologically healthy and socially just society, as it is mentioned on their website. So NENA facilitates connections, showcases, and promotes innovative projects, builds peer-to-peer learning, use collective strategies, in partnership with local communities across Australia to map out shared priorities and co-create and advocate for change. So we found NENA as an ideal partner, and we are very proud and pleased that NENA has handed us help, a lot of help, including in this project that we started in the beginning of this, from the beginning of this year, called Reimagining Quality of Life. And why quality of life? There are so many other important subjects, you may say. Well, perhaps sustainability, perhaps democracy, perhaps justice, social justice. I think historically speaking, life is under a massive global threat, and if anyone has had any doubts, I think the global pandemic must have actually removed that doubt. And also we have, as Michelle mentioned, we have seen a growing movement, I would say perhaps beyond GDP movement, a well-being movement, that you can see at all levels, from government to civil society to communities. And we have seen that more and more governments, you can think of Scotland, you can think of New Zealand, you can think of England, you can think of Canada, they have started to prioritize well-being over just merely focusing on the economic aspect of life, which has mostly determined our plannings, our policy makings, etc., etc. But this indicates that the more we have this growing, the more the issue of quality of life will become politicized and will become more centralized, and becomes the subject of conflicts over how to define quality of life. Who has the legitimacy to define quality of life? And I'm sure the corporate sector and the state sector would make sure that their influences continue to escalate. And then we ask, how about the communities? How about the dissent, the dissidents? How about the disadvantaged? How about the grassroots? And I think here we need a conscious or conscientious scholarship, a transformative scholarship from the universities. We need to see more of such projects being developed in partnership with groups, with networks like NENA, to actually give voice to the people, to those forces that need to be heard. So the research questions that we actually try to answer through this are just two simple ones. What are the key transformative forces that promote alternative visions of quality of life and well-being? And we are very much dependent on NENA to help us in that, to map through their networks. And the second one is, what does quality of life mean to these players? And that would require something beyond mapping and surveying, interviewing a sample. We don't say that these samples and these studies and the results of the studies would represent the entire community, but we hope that actually this would open up this space and create a platform for many of us to contribute. So the aim is to publicize as much as we can the debate and incorporate the voices of the marginalized, the transformative forces into the equation. And for those who are interested, you can go to the website of the University of Newcastle. Our research team or network is called Alternative for Futures Research Network. And here is the page for the Reimagining Quality of Life, where you can find more details. And also we have a website outside the university website called Common Alternatives. By subscribing to that website, you can hear more from us, hopefully. And thank you so much for your attention. Back to you. I'm sorry if I took more time than needed.
No, that was great. Thank you, Hamed. It's always good to have an overview. What we'll do now is I'll take off my facilitator hat and I'll put on my speaking hat. And if you can just bear with me, I've just got to juggle some buttons. There we go. All right. So I want to make sure that people know I am speaking as someone who is not an economist. I am, my Western education is as a lawyer and I guess a not-for-profit manager, but as someone who identified probably a very long time before we created AELA, the need for more community folks, for more people to be engaged in the discussion about the society we want, that economics has become this sort of dominant language in our Western society, which we do challenge through a whole range of ways we talk in meetings and in our materials. But as someone who is one of the co-founders of the New Economy Network Australia, what I wanted to share today was, I guess, insights into some of the thinking about what we're trying to do. And it's an absolute choose your own adventure. We're putting this together as we go. It's responsive, it's experimental. We do not aim to be perfect analysis folks. Sorry, I'm being distracted by a teenager and a dog at my door. We're not pretending to be experts in current economic thinking. What we're interested in is building a very different future. And unfortunately, there's no handbook for that. There's no ticker box process for that. What we're doing is bringing everyone's energy together. And the reason I offered to do a short talk on well-being economy or well-being economics or is it a viable alternative to capitalism, is the 5-year journey NENA has had in building its network, in bringing people together, in trying to create a system where all our little hubs are free to explore and do the work they want to do, whilst also generating this broader conversation about the economic system. So I'm going to run through just a number of slides, but at the same time, I'll be kind of narrating the story of NENA and the learning that we've been engaging in as we go along. So my question, are well-being economics a viable alternative to capitalism? I would say a resounding yes. But of course, there's a whole bunch of longer issues underneath that. We have a lot of work to do, and our current systems are built on a growth-focused, human-centered, hierarchical, patriarchal values, and the power structures that come with them are actually very old in Western society. So yes, we need to continue building and amplifying the new systems, but we also need to challenge the existing power barriers to transforming our society. So that's the short answer. That's my talk. If you now want to go and make a cup of tea, you're welcome to, but I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on that. So I'm going to have just 2 points. What's wrong with capitalism anyway? And what's happening in the wellbeing economy space that might be of interest to some of you? So to answer what's wrong with capitalism or our current system, I always ask 2 questions back at people so they can think for themselves. The first question is our current economic system sustainable? Consumer capitalism is using up our Earth's resources basically faster than the planet can replenish them. The Global Footprint Network talks about how many planets we're using. And of course, Australia is a high consumer society. It indicates that if everyone lived like us, we'd need 4.8 planets. And a quote that shocked me when I was doing my PhD on how to regulate to reduce consumption, and I confess academics won't like the fact that this quote at the bottom is actually from 1992, but it's powerful because it's from 1992. In 1992, it was written that humanity had used more resources since 1950 than in all previous human history combined. That's Alan Durning's How Much Is Enough, still a fantastic analysis. The statistics, the data's outdated, but the analysis is perfect. So that's one question. Is our economic system sustainable? And then the other one is our current economic system fair? And we know it's not. We wouldn't be on this call if you thought it was fair. Profound inequalities exist across the globe and in every nation. The escalating resource consumption since the 1950s isn't due to everyone getting the material resources they need to live. So it's worth repeating. Yes, we're consuming more, but it's not because everyone's getting 2 yachts each. What we're seeing is the planet's richest 1% owning more than half the world's wealth, while billions of people around the world don't have quite enough to get by on a daily basis, just in food alone. So we've got these 2 questions that we can answer in the negative. Our current economic system isn't fair and it's not sustainable. So how did we get here? I always like to remind folks that it's much older than just neoliberalism. We blame current market economics, but let's quickly, and in 30 seconds, race through 10,000 years of history. Neoliberalism in the 80s with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and all of the economists behind them in the US and Britain particularly, yes, we accelerated a system into a place where everything is commodified so it can be bought and sold and owned. But after the Second World War, that very mode of thinking was behind the Great Acceleration, which I'm going to show a couple of graphs about. But before that, the European Industrial Revolution transformed the already expansionist and extractivist mode of European colonization. So they'd started to move from Europe into other places to use their resources and take them back to their own countries as early as the late 1500s, the Industrial Revolution literally gave them more capacity to do so. And then other writers like Derek Jensen talk about, and many people say this, particularly Indigenous communities point to the shift to large-scale agricultural societies, and 10,000 years ago shifted humanity into an extractivist mode. There's some great books there that I've listed, but if that's the big picture, if that's the history of it, how ingrained are these systems in our culture, and can we actually undo any of it? I always like to share this material because it blew my hair back when I first discovered it years ago when Will Steffen spoke to it. The Great Acceleration is basically, after the Second World War, the major mode of global organizing. The major powers who won the Second World War and took control of international structures and politics were also the same group that had the technological capacity to simply take more from planet Earth. So the Great Acceleration matters. And this is the fundamental reason why capitalism is so bad for everybody. It allows people to take more than they need, and then our distributive system allows some people to have more than others. And of course, the living world rarely gets a look in. All right, so we're left with a whole bunch of problems today. That is the speediest I can kind of look at what are some of the issues in capitalism. It's what we do, but it's how we own and break down and distribute the stuff we get out of what we do. So what's been happening to challenge capitalism? And this is the good stuff. So there's no more terrifying pictures of escalating extractivism. I love this cartoon from Lunik. You can probably see it appear in any of the NENA webinars by somebody. But the really good thing is that from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and before that through things like peasant revolts, but during the Industrial Revolution, people were coming together to unite as workers through cooperatives and mutuals. They were already forging responses to the hierarchical, unfair nature of capitalism. And to jump forward, a lot of those responses that then combined with ecological knowledge of how much was being extracted, really we saw a big shift in the Western civilized, Western countries in the 70s, seeing this challenge to growth economics. But it's no, I guess, overstatement to say that a lot of these people were really condemned by other economists and policymakers around the world, proven by the fact that Limits to Growth came out in the 70s, neoliberalism emerged as a tsunami of economic thinking in the 80s and actually escalated extractivism even more. But the point is, if we're thinking about well-being economy or whatever you want to frame alternatives to capitalism, there's lots of different ways to do it. And what we saw emerging around this time was some really, really important thinking that challenged the status quo of capitalism. Steady state, ecological economics, degrowth, social solidarity movements like REPES that NENA is part of, sharing economy, collaborative economy, new economy, the New Economy Coalition in the US, the New Economy Organising Network. There has been a steady, very important and ongoing movements from unions, environmentalists, but also people inside grassroots economic activities. For me, one of the really big turning points for thinking about the ecological crisis was when Will Steffen, Johan Rockström, and a few others developed this amazing concept. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. I won't speak to it, but if you're not, please Google it and look up planetary boundaries, because it was the really pivotal point where Western scientists tried to quantify what we need in our society to live within safe operating biophysical parameters. It spoke to the point that people in sustainability movements had been talking about for ages, that Indigenous people talked about in different ways, which is the environment is the ultimate space within which we have to do everything, including economic activity to support people and planet. And many people have heard of donut economics. It's becoming quite the wave of thinking, and it's all built out of planetary boundaries. Kate says that when she saw the planetary boundaries, she wondered where the people were. She started to draw into that. And all of this links to the current move in well-being economy. So that's the donut, the classic image of what the donut looks like, and happy to talk to you guys about any of that. So how does well-being economics fit within this? Capitalism's been there. We know this extractivist mode, this hierarchical, unjust system of ownership control. But then we see from the 1970s, these changes, these challenges. But can well-being economics really unravel the mess? I mean, how can one way of thinking challenge this predominant way of thinking. And I want to say, I don't think it can. I don't think there's one single solution to the big issues we're facing. It's too complex. But what I want to say, so the concept of well-being is not new. As we put in the blurb for this webinar series, you know, the ancient Greeks were contemplating what is a good life. But what is new is that we're seeing an entire range of global movements framing the transition away from capitalism towards well-being. And this is the only thing I wanted to say about NENA. In 2016, when we had 150 people in the room and tried to find the right framing to bring everyone together, we knew that there were people from many different movements already, but how did we bring them together in the next phase? And we threw the idea, could you live with new economy? Because there's not another framing that we can find that covers the whole lot, doesn't alienate feminists, doesn't alienate Indigenous people, doesn't alienate the social solidarity movement. And then 2 years later, the Wellbeing Economy, I'll just jump to this, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, the international network began, and I'll wrap up now, but this is where some of the really interesting work is starting to happen globally. It's in the West, but they're trying to bring together some of the framing. And I just wanted to mention that, they've got this fantastic guide. And it's actually, if you're interested, have a little look at it, because even reading through it, it shows you some of the key aspects of what well-being economy looks like. And of course, I'm sure most Australians are aware, I certainly look with great envy across the ditch and see what New Zealand's up to in terms of their well-being economy. And their civil society movement connected to the well-being economy movement is really exploring these different ways of doing. And the one thing I wanted to show you all, I'll end my slides now, but I just wanted to tell you that in case you don't know, we have some pretty amazing people like Mike Salvaris and others working on the Australian National Development Index, or ANDI. And I'll put the web link in here. And Mike, myself and several others are working to bring the Wellbeing Economy Australia Hub to be a parallel project together with NENA, so that we can keep building all the good stuff into one place. So I'm over time, but that's my presentation, and I'm really glad that I can finish talking at you. I think in a nutshell, can wellbeing economics offer a viable alternative? Yes. And certainly by digging deep into the roots of what we think is valuable and important, that is how we start to take that transition back out, building on the shoulders of everyone who's come before us and acknowledging some very deep-seated power structures that we need to challenge and batten down. So I'll now take my indulgent speaker hat off and put my facilitator hat back on. Thank you for your attention, everybody. And Hamed, I'd now like to invite you to speak to us, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if we mentioned something about the conference, NENA'S conference and its theme, which is well-being, right? Michelle?
I should bring that up. Yeah, it's on the website. Yes.
Yes. Okay. And I think I forgot, or maybe I need to remind that our audience that this is a part of a longer series of the webinars, and this is the first one. We will have 4 or 5 more, maybe 2 in September, and there will be almost monthly. And we will invite every session 3 speakers from different different perspectives to express their views about quality of life. So we would like to extend our invitation to everyone for the next sessions, and hope you will find them useful. Okay, it's well, my presentation, I can make it ready. Sorry, just a minute. Yes, just as a maybe a disclaimer, I should say that what I'm presenting here has 2 sections. The first one is I start with a criticism of the conventional discourses or views about quality of life or well-being, if you like. And the second part is where I proposed a kind of a new idea or a new platform for thinking beyond that conventional view. So what I'm presenting, especially the first part, the critical part, the criticism, may not, I mean, it corresponds generally to the values of the team and the purpose of the project, but but it doesn't necessarily represent everybody's view among the research teams or NENA. And the second part, which is the proposal under the title of Well-Living, it's my contribution to this series and to this project. And it's of course subject to debate and criticism, and I definitely welcome and appreciate your feedback. To be a little bit more precise, actually, I thought maybe I would better to read out my draft. And although I'm running the risk of making things a little bit tedious, but I promise that that won't be as tedious or monotonous as the speeches made by my favorite intellectual, Noam Chomsky. So I appreciate, I apologize and appreciate if you bear with me. Okay. Many officials, policymakers, and political elite on the center left of the spectrum across the developed world have already acknowledged the inadequacy of using monetary measures like GDP to address the type of social and ecological crises we face today. Let's call this the Beyond GDP movement. Okay. As a step in that direction, many interesting indicators have been invented to not only measure economic performance in terms of the size of the wealth created inside the nation states or across nation states, but also the non-monetary aspects like the people's access to different key services, the status of public health, the individual's happiness and satisfaction with their lives, the distribution of economic resources, citizens' engagements in politics, and people's capacities to meet their needs and to grow their talent through quality public education, secure jobs, standard housing, accessible public transport, sustainable energy sources, etc., etc. I'm not saying there is something wrong with that, but I think we need to go beyond, as I will explain later. Examples at the national level include the UK's Measuring National Wellbeing Programme, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, Bhutan's Gross National Happiness or GNH Index, measures of Australia's progress, and more recently, the Australian National Development Index, known as ANDI. Now, examples at the international level includes OECD's Better Life Index, that actually shows Australia is #2 after Norway, which actually creates a lot of concerns in me when I look at that and compare it with real life here. The World Happiness Index, the UN Human Development Index, and the EU's GDP and Beyond initiative. And some of you might also be heard about the United Nations recent Sustainable Development Goals that can be considered as part of this movement as well. Now, the Beyond GDP movement has a rather longer history than this. And it's a very interesting one. It has gained greater momentum since 2008 GFC, global financial crisis, and it is expected to receive even bigger attention in the post-COVID era for the very obvious reasons. Now, once again, the idea of well-being has become a catchphrase for many to express their dissatisfaction with the politics of reducing progress to economic growth and to demand a more holistic approach to assessing quality of life. At a civil society and grassroots activism level, like the well-being economy, for instance, is an alternative system to the dominant growth-oriented mentality is widely proposed and debated, which we can actually, I personally consider as a progress. In this presentation, however, while I welcome this re-energized wave as a potential step forward, I am going to argue that this ideological change will not result in a meaningful change in reality unless we critically reflect on the politics of good quality of life and publicize the debate as much as possible. So a much broader range of voices, visions, dreams, and concerns would be heard and incorporated. Towards the end, I propose the concept of well-living only as a broad platform to stimulate more free thinking and groundbreaking practices, hopefully. Let me stress here that the idea of well-living is not proposed as another fixed notion to replace well-being. I do not deny the value of existing well-intended efforts by many civil society actors, independent practitioners, critical academics in many different areas that operate under the current notions of well-being to address the concerns of many disadvantaged groups. However, well-being as a political reformist project runs out of legitimacy from my point of view for several reasons that I will shortly describe. Okay, and these are the two reasons. Why it is necessary to have a new platform or framework instead of reclaiming the ones widely employed, we may ask. Well, the answer is that the idea of good quality of life and its associated terminologies have long been appropriated, watered down, and co-opted by the reformist side of the establishment. So far, this has resulted in nothing more than some slow and incremental shifts in policymaking, followed by many setbacks. Following what we have learned from the history of power and counterpower, I tend to believe that when the elite learns to incorporate the language of opposition into theirs to improve their public legitimacy, it is then the time for the opposition to reinvent their language to increase the contrast between their uncompromisable values and those of the top. This will help alleviate confusion in the public debates and create a fresh mindset for liberating our imaginations from conventional wisdom, or the so-called conventional wisdom. Okay, now the quest for good life is very much embedded in our human nature or psyche. As humans moved away from the hunter-gathering lifestyle to the cultivating economies, hierarchical power structure consolidated and competitive behaviors for grabbing arable lands and accumulated produces intensified. From this point in time, the political economy of well-being was born. And with that, the idea of good life became a utopian ideology to manufacture consent among the masses, but it also fit the ideology of resistance. In other words, good life became the subject of contention between the oppressed and the oppressor. Eastern gurus, Middle Eastern prophets, and Western philosophers of antiquity worked hard to answer the very critical question of what makes a life worth living. Is it the achievements, the pleasure we pursue and the pains we avoid, as the Epicureans argued, or alternatively, is it the actualization of our human capabilities and flourishing our faculties or achieving a more meaningful life despite all the pains, as the eudaimonists argued? A never-ending argument that has lasted until our time. As humans developed sophisticated systems to manage limited resources, and thus to elevate their quality of life, and as some groups gain upper hand over others, the quest for better life became associated with conquest, control, and dominance. European colonialism is perhaps the shiniest example of this trend, where racism, slavery, assimilation, you can remember the lost generations and the stolen generations, and exploitation of the other were justified by valuing better life for the colonizer and also the colonized, but only in the colonizer's terms. The 20th century European fascism looked forward to creating the perfect man and measured mama's milk. Eugenics, meaning good creation, was first brought forth by the British social Darwinists and later practiced widely in the US, promised to reduce human suffering by breeding out diseases, disabilities, and so-called undesirable characteristics from the human race or human population. President Truman in 1949 launched the era of developmentalism to rival communism by declaring the necessity of helping the underdeveloped countries to raise their standards of living. In the post-colonial and post-World War II era, the internationalization of the so-called Western way of living, or the American way of living, strive to homogenize the world. Lyndon Johnson, who started the Vietnam War in the 1960s, described the good society as a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quality of their goods. What a progressive idea, wasn't that? However, the standards of such a good society were predefined based on the anthropocentric values of a growth maniac mode of living. During the Cold War, it was first the moral obligation of the welfare state to ensure higher standards of the living for the citizens, an obligation that was almost ended with the rise of neoliberalism, according to which people's passive submission to the magic of market would take us all to the promised land of capitalism, a hollow utopianism in disguise that turned out to be nothing more than a nightmare for the majority of the planet's inhabitants, human and non-human. Neoliberalism conned us into believing that individuals are ultimately responsible for their well-being, and the towering happiness well-being industry has provided us with tons of gadgets and self-help guides and services, replacing political conscience with mental numbness and equating political apathy with happiness. Centering social progress merely on GDP is limited to powerful yet small circles of intellectual and political elite. Today, many center-left progressive policy advisors, national and transnational civil society organizations in the West, including the well-resourced community organizations and academic think tanks, have also contributed to the so-called Beyond GDP movement. Although many of these agents do not fully share the neoliberal, colonial, and anti-democratic values of the establishment, their contribution to the needed radical shift is remaining very limited for a simple reason. They do not problematize the very system that is the ultimate cause of current horrifying crisis and declining quality of planetary life.
Excuse me, Hamed.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, my darling. You have 2 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought I have 20 minutes.
Well,
okay.
you can have 20 minutes. It's our webinar. You continue.
Oh, okay, no. In total,
I thought we had 15.
Okay, no, okay. If that's
continue.
Okay. Yeah,
It's
okay.
fine.
Sorry, I'll try to cut and jump.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead. It's good.
Yeah, okay. In simple terms, the so-called progressive well-being discourse only assesses the extent to which the real capitalist society stands against the principles of their idealized human capitalism. This is exactly where the contradiction begins, because there is no humane capitalism anymore. Now, what are the impacts of this history on the way that we today actually try to define quality of life? These reformist discourses of well-being can be several legacies of the capitalist well-being mindset. They follow the modern myth of progress as defined within the Western modernist frameworks. Their way of quantification hides more than it reveals. They practically assess well-having rather than well-being by measuring the amount of goods and services. They incorporate social equality into their equations, but only as a precondition for more sustainable economic growth. Their narrow perceptions of ecological sustainability only serves the concerns of the wiser fractions of the economic elite. They reduce the well-being of communities to a statistical sum of their individual needs and resources. And they still subconsciously follow the colonial mentality of a standardization, classification, and ranking. They take into account the so-called individual's capabilities to flourish, but only in the capitalist market dominated by corporate interest or hegemonies, and the list goes on and on. Just again to accelerate, possibly when we can say that current dominance of the technocratic, expert-driven, top-down approaches to well-being has made it very difficult to save the idea and reintegrate it into the truly transformative project. It is time to think of a new notion that would liberate our imagination from the Eurocentric, individualistic, economistic, class-blind, gender-blind, color-blind, and ecology-blind perceptions of quality of life. Now, okay, let me then get to the proposal. Then you might ask, what's the solution then? In response to the paradoxes and inadequacies of mainstream well-being discourses and inspired by indigenous movements in the global south, in the so-called developing world that advocate for post-capitalist futures, I propose the alternative idea of well-living. Well-living can function at least as a fresh platform for dialogue to represent a transition in our understanding of quality of life, free from contradictions of capitalist way of living, as Michelle beautifully presented. Well-living cannot be another term to enforce a single perception of good life as a global standard, no matter how progressive that vision is. Rather, it only determines a set of values for a multiverse of ideas to emerge and to succeed. And that very corresponds, I believe, to what organizations like NENA do to bring people, different voices together. The question here is not primarily about how far my ecological and social conditions are suitable to me to obtain my pleasure or to obtain more pleasure and avoid pain or even to fulfill my true self. Well, living at a societal level is not just the sum or average of consumerist individuals' satisfaction with their material possessions, regardless of how miserable life is for the underprivileged. And well, living as a general framework, rather than a fixed notion, is a new arena that allows us to envision our ways out of the current fatal status quo. So I think these are the 5 perhaps principles that I can attribute to the idea of well-being, just to make it, a little bit, just to draw the counters of it in this platform. So these are the principles. 1, empowering the self and the other to become true authors of their own faith, diversifying and sharing experiences and knowledge, promoting sufficiency by commoning resources, promoting solidarity, equity, and peaceful coexistence, and living deeply in balance with nature. These 5 also corresponds, if you may remember, to the 5 C's that I presented earlier. Well-living therefore encourages actors to think about the best ways of achieving inner harmony within the individual, between the individuals and their communities, and between the culture and the nature. I skipped some of these writings, and I better, perhaps to save time, just end with this, that it is a project and a process, not a mere outcome or an afforded status or a static condition or a state of a being or a number to be measured or something to be measured. It is about dreaming, becoming, producing meaning as aspiringly as autonomously as possible in this process. I'm sorry for the abstract talk, but I'm sure Shelley will help me out by giving you more ideas about concrete examples. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Hamed. And if you could stop sharing now, Hamed, that would be great. And Shelley, over to you. You still have your 15 minutes. We'll have a bit less time for chat at the end, but it's all good. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everybody. Before I get started, very quickly, I just want to acknowledge the Darkinjung peoples, who are the traditional owners of the lands of which I'm speaking to you from today on the Central Coast, and to extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today in the seminar. I think it's incredibly important that we have those voices as part of these conversations. The knowledge is, held by First Nations people, both in this country and across the globe. I think, we have so much to learn. So a lot of my work draws from those knowledges as well. And I want to acknowledge and extend my gratitude for that too. So obviously, there's a lot to talk about in this space. I resonate with a lot of what Hamed talks about, and I've been thinking about these things in terms of problem solving a lot recently. So it's really exciting to be able to share ideas with like minds. So today I'm going to begin briefly by discussing the role of colonialism and how it relates to present day societal structures, outlining how this in turn is really inhibiting our collective capacities to achieve the meaningful systemic changes that I think are required to ensure that quality of life is shared equitably across socioeconomic and cross-cultural identities. So while it's really important to obviously create broader understandings around the causes of systemic inequalities that limit both individual and collective capabilities in achieving these equal standards of living and well-being. Today, I want to try and present a model that I think is redefining how well-being is understood through a decolonial lens, which is founded on not so new, but old ways which are already here, embedded in the wisdom of all of the ancient sentient countries that we all live on, and that are embodied by First Nations knowledge holders. So the ideas and frameworks that I work with are not complete or definitive, but they really draw on Indigenous ontologies and axiologies, which are just sort of ways of being and doing, but really importantly recognise the need for solutions to be both place-based and reflexive. So, responsive to those communities that they're stemming from. So the liberation strategies that I explore emphasise the need for practice to, that is unapologetically decolonial in practice. And they need to be evidenced by things like accountability and outcomes, which are defined not by the government or other colonial institutions, but by the people in the communities themselves. So in responding to socio-political and economic inequalities that are perpetuated by ongoing colonialism, Aboriginal communities across Australia have been enacting self-determination principles through autonomous governance mechanisms, reclaiming greater control over their lives. And this is really important in terms of thinking about quality of life and well-being. So shortly I'm going to share with you an example of this by introducing the Euromen Project. But firstly, I briefly want to just provide some background on why I believe centering the issue of race in Australia is so important. Not just a process of decolonisation, but the implications that this has on achieving well-being and quality of life for society more broadly. Okay, so we know capitalism and colonisation go hand in hand. Where we see one, there is inevitably the other. So, but further, really inexplicably tied to both colonisation and capitalism is the notion of race. So when capitalist systems were first developing in the US, this new mental category termed race was constructed to essentially codify the relations between conquering and conquered populations. So as capitalism expanded into a global system, race was really used as the fundamental criterion to determine how labour was being divided and who would control those resources of production, which essentially embedded overarching power inequities through categories based on skin colour. However, notions of colonisation and structural racism are largely consigned to historical context. So these are things, that we think about having happened in the past that are not so relevant now. My work really focuses race and colonisation as not just relevant to modern societies, but I think in remaining absolutely central to the socio-political and economic systems and structures that operate globally today, and this is especially the case in contemporary Australia. So as discourses around decolonisation are increasingly popularised, it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, we're hearing it across a range of political and public contexts, the very foundations of white settlement in this country go unresolved. So Australia, along with other members of the Kansas Alliance, remains a settler colonial nation state. So what this essentially means is that while other countries around the world did undergo processes of decolonisation that saw colonisers withdraw from occupied states or countries, albeit to varying degrees of success, in Australia and other settler colonial states, the colonisers did not leave. So this is particularly important here because unlike Canada, New Zealand and the United States, with the exception of very recent developments in Victoria, Australia is the only British outpost that continues to deny the sovereignty of its First Peoples, with no real treaty arrangements in place at all to date. So in this sense, we need to understand settler colonialism, not just as an event that occurred in the past, but as a structure that continues to determine political mechanisms and those overarching socio-economic systems that are weighted really heavily in favour of colonial interests. But in terms of quality of life and what we're thinking about here today, in talking about the role of coloniality, I'm really highlighting the impacts that these elements have, not just on wellbeing indicators for dispossessed First Peoples, but for societies more broadly. And perhaps most importantly, I'm really trying to draw attention to the long-standing work and the existing models lived by First Peoples in this country in the fight against colonisation and colonialism and capitalism. So what I want to do with you is share what I've learned in terms of the critical skills and approaches used by First communities in breaking the damaging cycles of colonialism and capitalism, and in pursuing a better life for both human and more than human kin. So got a couple of crazy graphics here for you, and a lot of this is my work, my recent work from my PhD. So I'm not going to unpack all of this, but basically what this represents is what relates to this unresolved contestation over sovereignties between First Nations and settlers, which I describe as oppositional worldviews. So quite simply, on one hand, we have Western neoliberal capitalist ideals that we know idolise money and really view land as resource to be owned or exploited. And this is quite a simplistic binary, and obviously it's not so clear cut. But on the other hand, we then sort of have more Indigenous worldviews, which are underpinned by notions of what I term kincentric relationality, where land is law and ethics, and all things, both human and more than human, are kin with which we share a mutual responsibility. So for First Peoples in Australia whose health and wellbeing fundamentally centres around connection to country, this has been one of the this has long been one of the main challenges around the ongoing colonial dispossession, and it's not a new phenomenon. So in this sense, many Aboriginal communities are way ahead of other facets of society in terms of delinking from colonial and capitalist apparatuses, having maintained or returned to land-based law and ethics and concentric relationalities, which are underpinned by a sense of collective care. So in doing so, these communities are reclaiming control over how quality of life is determined, and critically how wellbeing for all, and not just some, can be achieved. So thinking through, I guess, problem-solving frameworks, we have, this sort of problem with coloniality. So again, there's quite a lot of ideas in these slides, and I'm not going to unpack them all, but essentially in centering settler colonialism, which is underpinned by capitalist and neoliberal ideas, we can gain a better understanding around current problem-solving frameworks and why those approaches used by governments or other colonial agents don't really work or aren't that effective when it comes to addressing really complex social problems, which have essentially been politicised. So I've got some different examples here, but I would suggest that this also relates to how notions of well-being and quality of life have been co-opted into the agendas of colonial projects. And like Hamed, I propose that we need new tools and frameworks. As I've said here, a radical shift to new methodologies, which encompass cross-institutional and intercultural approaches. Okay, so two of the models that I've been really thinking through is something called collective impact, an example of collective impact justice reinvestment. So both of these models really emphasise the need to break beyond silo thinking and to centre place-based capacity building, which focuses on the specific circumstances of communities where movements are taking place. So they recognise that complex social problems cannot be solved by single organisations. What they also support is collective action that is independent of government agents, which means that projects are less likely to be interfered with by external interests. So what this also means is that communities are able to determine their own parameters. For example, empowering people to define what quality of life or well-being means across cultural, social, and political dimensions. Okay, so this is the Euromen Project, which is an example of justice reinvestment, which is a model that's been gaining a lot of traction in Australia in terms of addressing deeply rooted systemic issues that result in the mass hyper-incarceration of First Peoples in Australia. So I decided to present this particular project because it really focuses around land as ethics, but also as connecting to country as absolutely essential to our well-being. And I think that's something that we all kind of resonated with in terms of the recent lockdowns with COVID, you know, not being able to get outside and get back to nature and travel and things like that. I think people, you know, have started thinking about you know, how important connection to country or connection to nature and our more than human kin actually are for our social and mental well-being. So, so what both of these models also think through is not just place-based capacity building, but focusing on the specific circumstances of the communities. They recognise that complex social problems need to be, sorry, I've said that, need, you know, lots of minds that are working together. So what it also means that communities are defining their own parameters. Sorry, I've gone back again. Okay, so the Euromen Project. So this essentially started in the year 2000 because elders of 4 language groups in the West Kimberley region of the Northern Territory were really concerned about a lot of issues with their youth around self-harm, substance abuse and suicide, including high contact rates with police and the criminal justice system. So elders saw a need for a place where youth could really separate themselves from the negative influences brought on by colonisation, to reconnect with culture in a remote and culturally significant place. So the project aims to achieve multiple outcomes, which really focus on quality of life and wellbeing for youth and communities more broadly. So to achieve these goals, there's multiple strategies that they're employing. So reconnecting youth with culture, which results in strengthening of self-identity and increased self-esteem, increased community ownership and awareness of factors that are affecting quality of life and wellbeing. Fostering positive relationships between young people, mentors, cultural leaders, which includes spending a lot of time on country with elders. And these activities serve to reconnect Aboriginal kids to country, which we know is an essential component of health and wellbeing and positive identity. So what this project also does is focus on developing formal and informal partnerships between community and other relevant service providers, which really results in an increased capacity to appropriately respond to the issue at hand, you know, which is the at-risk youth in those places. So Euromen has 2 aspects to its governance and management processes. So the management processes are undertaken by the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Cultural Centre, or KALAC. So KALAC sponsors the Euromen Project and attends to issues of admin, financial management, staff employment reporting, etc. But Euromen retains its own project governance, which is independent of KALAC and also you know, therefore independent of government agents. So importantly, this project is also funded under a broader strategy of justice reinvestment model. So essentially what this means is that funds that were once allocated to prisons, corrections budgets have actually been reinvested into the community initiatives that Euromen are developing themselves on the ground. So enabling this place-based capacity building. So in terms of measuring indicators of success, this can be problematic for projects like Euromen, which makes them also critical in forging new understandings of how quality of life is actually determined. While quantifiable results such as a decrease in suicide rates and reduced contact with the criminal justice system are obviously really useful, for the Aboriginal community and the youth, what they've stated as more valuable factors, such as cultural connectedness, are purely qualitative. So in essence, this project provides us with a model that really challenges the very foundations of how quality of life is defined and measured. So it also offers us insight into the potential non-incorporated initiatives or projects which are based on independent governance bodies have as vehicles for alternative ways of achieving well-being according to community standards, and not these kind of government instruments or indexes. So Euromen's governance works because there is and always has been a very clear sense of who established the project, why it was established, and what they want the project to achieve. So it's been incredibly successful in reclaiming self-determination for the communities involved, and is used as a best practice model for alternative approaches to improving community health and overall quality of life. So I know that was a really condensed kind of overview of the project, but this is my final slide, and basically this is kind of my brain on a bit of a page here in terms of thinking through different problem-solving frameworks and methodologies. So in terms of reimagining wellbeing and quality of life, I guess it's similar to Hamed's kind of notion of well living. I think there's so many different components that we need to consider in terms of delinking and from capitalist thinking, but things like decolonial problem methodologies, shifting from capitalist mentalities to these concentric relations, the example of rebuilding Indigenous nationhoods and cultural authorities, facilitating intercultural collaboration. I think there's so many different elements that we can start to bring together in terms of reclaiming how we are understanding quality of life and well-being, and how we can go about achieving it. So I think I'm probably on time, and I've just talked to you a lot, but again, this is not definitive, and these are really kind of just ideas that I'm thinking through. So it's been wonderful to be able to share them with people, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. So back to you, Michelle.
Oops. Wow. Thank you so much, Shelley. We're not having much luck with buttons. I've just accidentally muted you when I meant to unmute you, but you were already unmuted. Too many Zoom meetings, I think. Thank you so much. And I wonder if Shelley and Hamed, if you have any questions of each other. It's pretty quiet in the chat, other than people asking for copies of information, which is always nice. But I wonder, Shelley, if you've got any questions for Hamed or vice versa, while people have a think about any questions they have.
Oh, I did have lots of questions for you, Hamed, when you were, can I bring up the last slide again? Is that okay, Michelle?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let me share again.
You're on mute, Hamed.
Before that, if I'm allowed, I mentioned something about the survey, and I put a link to the survey if that's okay for the people to go online to click on that, maybe towards the end or soon after the end of the session, or we can also send that link to the email addresses of the audience. And we really appreciate if you can try to answer these questions. Shouldn't take more than 7 to 10 minutes. You need to actually choose only one option against each statement to what extent you think that is the case with each one of those statements. To what extent you think agree or disagree with each one of those statements. Not more than one option. So if you can do that, that would be great. And I
just want to say there's been 1 or 2 comments, private message to me, that had a bit of trouble ticking the right boxes. So if you have any trouble, don't worry. We'll send the link out again tomorrow, but do give it a go. All that information is so important. Thank you. Shelley, did you have, Hamed, I sent you a private note about the issue.
Yeah, sorry, hard for me to follow everything.
Yeah, I know. Okay, Shelley, did you have a question?
I'm just looking at the mad notes that I've scribbled down. But I'm wondering, Hamed, in terms of your well living model,
Yes.
and that article that you wrote, is it quite an early framework? Have you?
Yeah, I first published something in 2018 by the Australian quarterly.
Yeah.
And I have provided a link to that. I think when I was getting ready for this one, I thought I would extend it, and I realized that, okay, I mean, like every other piece of writing, when we get back to that, we realize how many mistakes or how many problems we have left behind. So I tried to, make some amendments. So I'll soon publish what I just presented as a complementary with a bit of a correction to that one. But thank you so much for raising that.
Yeah, no, I just think it's such a useful framework. I'm sure that in terms of application.
It's a very general one. I mean, I'm inviting everyone to contribute to this discourse. I mean, I know it's the concept sometimes may not be that important, but sometimes in order to differentiate and to contrast, sometimes we need perhaps new fresh ideas and new concepts. It's not something that I would say I have, any ownership of or something. It's what I have learned from, especially initially from the indigenous movements in Latin America, Buen Vivir or Living Well Together, as part of some research and the teachings. As you may possibly know, I teach a course. We teach a course in, I've got the honor of teaching that actually. Beautiful students at the University of Newcastle lab called Future Societies, and we actually study many alternatives. The first bit of the course is about criticizing, and then the rest of it is alternatives. And sometimes people think that I want them to stop their critical thinking when we move on to alternatives. And I have to explain that, no, actually, we have to extend. We are not going to do the alternatives a favor if we just fall in love with them. All of us are humans, we're not angels, and we're susceptible to regenerating all the insanity and injustices that are sometimes get into our genes. So it's the emphasis on being critical, even towards the most favorite alternatives, is on the agenda.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys. I have a quick question for Shelley, and I'm aware that we've only got 5 minutes left. We will have to end on time, but do be inspired by the fact that we have many more webinars on this topic coming up, and Hamed and Shelley and many others are doing deep research, and I'm sure would love to hear from you outside. But the quick question for you, Shelley, is I'm wondering how people who are non-Indigenous might come to understand at a lived level what Indigenous notions of quality of life feel like. Can I just answer, as someone who works with a lot of Indigenous mates, ask them?
Yes, that was what I was going to say.
I'm not being cheeky, Chris. Your question is very important. But yeah, and also I just want to say our next webinar will reflect Indigenous notions of quality of life, including the amazing and always wonderful Mary Graham, a Kombu Mary person and adjunct associate professor of philosophy and political science at UQ. But Shelley, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, honestly, I have literally written here in the corner of my page exactly that. Mary Graham is one of my gurus. She's just incredible, and that's why I definitely don't speak on certain things. So I think it's absolutely important to speak directly to people. And I think what's really important as well is to understand, and this is, I guess, where this idea of place-based comes from, because all people are so different. There's so much diversity in terms of, Aboriginal communities across the whole, across the whole of Australia, and also specifically in terms of those communities, people are people. So I think, definitely the best way is to speak to people. And my work is gathered from First Nations communities all over the world. So, and I say this, always as a disclaimer when I'm talking about, Indigenous methodologies or ontologies or whatever it is, I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of anyone, but more kind of presenting what I have gathered from a lot of deep research into this kind of stuff. But I think that's probably the short answer is that not to speak on behalf of anybody, but to have a conversation with someone.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Can I just give a quick plug? I've just put a note in. I'm privileged to be working with Anne Polina, Tyson Young-Porter, Mary Graham, and many others on the launch of Regenerative Songlines Australia. The website's there. The launch is on the 8th of July. It's free. It's online. Tickets are going fast. But if you'd like to join that network launch and have a listen to Indigenous views of the world, and also connect with Future Dreaming, which was created by Mary Graham, Ross Williams, and myself, to help share cross-cultural knowledge, but particularly around ecological and other good things.
Amazing.
So now there's another really good question. Nafi has said it would be good to allocate a session on cold communities. Hamed, do we have one?
Yes, actually, the very last one, we have already invited a couple of people who would talk more from the Islamic community point of view, the Muslim community, but we are also looking for more people, and hopefully we will find. So the last one would be, I guess, in November, the 5th one, if I'm not mistaken. But we will release all the news.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. There's another question here. They're coming in a bit thicker and faster now, which is great. Sally just said to say thank you for info about the Australian National Development Index, or ANDI. Yes, I can't stress enough to everyone how much amazing work they've done. So do visit their website. Michael has said, I'd love to hear some clear visions about what is well-being. I don't know if we've got time for that in 1 minute left. What do you think, Hamed?
I think that's something that the people who are the subject of it should define. Yes, it's our job to mostly to give them the chance as far as we can, depending on the skills we have.
Excellent. And there's a nice comment here from JP. I'd love to hear perspectives about how we shift our mind and heart from being hyper-focused on quantity towards expanding our sensibilities around quality. Let's answer that one, and then we might have to wrap up. Any general thoughts, Hamed or Shelley?
So could you repeat that? I'm trying
about shifting from measuring quantity of stuff to measuring the quality of life, the actual measuring of that.
Yeah, when we talk about measurements, it's about quantification. So measuring quality in itself, it's kind of a misnomer. It's kind of a self-contradictory thing. However, I understand that sometimes we need to quantify to give ourselves some overview of what is happening. But normally the quantifications from social scientists, scientific point of view, helps us to touch the surface. It gives us a broad view, but it's not that deep. So that's why some of us prefer mixing the methods. So we mix the quantity and quality together to have both the overview of the surface of what's happening and the in-depth view of what's going on in the minds of people, how they experience things and how they live through lives.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I'm sorry that we had a few hiccups today, but I'm sure we're all a bit used to it on Zoom. And thanks so much to Hamed and Shelley for your wonderful talks and patience and amazing research. Just this last image we'll leave you with is a plug for, oh, I put the wrong date in the chat box. Anyway, our next webinar in this series, it's all happening today. It's the 14th of July. Don't miss it. Please register. We've got Mary Graham, Daniela Hill, and Ajay Ranta. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So that's about it for now, folks. If you're not already connected to NENA for updates about all of our wonderful activities, please get on the website, join up for our very exciting, well, they're not that exciting, but for our fortnightly update of all of our events. And thank you so much. Shelley and Hamed, did you want to say farewell?
Yeah,
I do. Thank you so much for asking me to be a part of it. It's fantastic to connect with everybody.
Thank you for taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. See
All
you
the very
soon. Bye.